Captain Dave Morrison leaned back in his chair, coffee growing cold as he watched the new civilian employee organize files with mechanical precision. 3 days of watching Sarah Chen work administrative support had convinced him she was just another bureaucrat who'd never understand real military operations. "Hey, Sarah," he called out with a smirk, loud enough for the other officers in the briefing room to hear. "Since you're always asking technical questions about our exercises, what's your call sign? You know, like the real operators have?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison expected confusion, maybe embarrassment at being exposed as someone playing at military knowledge. His teammates chuckled, waiting for the stumbling response that would put the civilian in her proper place. Instead, Sarah Chen looked up from her paperwork with eyes that suddenly seemed different, colder, more focused, carrying weight that hadn't been there moments before. The Donna transformation was so subtle that most people missed it, but something in her expression made the laughter die in Morrison's throat. "My call sign," she said quietly, her voice carrying an edge that none of them had heard before, "is Phantom Zero." The briefing room went dead silent. Every special operations veteran present felt their blood turn to ice. Phantom Zero wasn't just a call sign. It was a legend whispered in training centers and deployment briefings. The operator whose longest confirmed kill had redefined what the Army considered possible, the sniper whose classified missions had saved an entire battalion in Afghanistan. Morrison's face went pale as he realized he'd just asked a joke question to someone whose answer would haunt him for the rest of his career. But 3 days earlier, none of them had suspected that the quiet woman processing their paperwork was anything more than another civilian transfer trying to learn military procedures. The morning mist clung to the perimeter fence of Fort Braxton as a dusty Honda Accord pulled into the visitor parking lot just after dawn. The car looked like it belonged to a civilian contractor or maybe a new administrative hire. Nothing that would draw attention from the MPs manning the main gate. She stepped out wearing dark jeans, a plain gray pullover, and scuffed hiking boots that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup. Nothing flashy. The only hint of her real background was the way she moved, economical, purposeful, like someone who'd learned not to waste motion in places where efficiency meant survival. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres barely glanced up from his clipboard as she approached the gate. Another civilian transfer, probably heading to the admin building for in-processing. He'd seen hundreds just like her over the years. Contractors, support staff, people who worked around the military without really being part of it. "Purpose of visit?" he asked without real interest. "Reporting for duty," she said quietly, handing over a set of orders that looked routine enough. Sarah Chen. Administrative support. Torres scanned the paperwork with practiced efficiency. Standard permanent change of station. Nothing unusual except maybe how light the background details were. The name meant nothing to him. Just another clerk being shuffled around the system to fill quotas and manage bureaucracy. "Building 12, ma'am. Follow the main road. You can't miss it." He handed back her ID card and waved her through with the same casual indifference he showed to delivery drivers and maintenance contractors. "Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today?" Behind the gate, 2 soldiers leaned against a concrete barrier, sharing coffee and the easy conversation of men with time to kill before their real duties began. "Another desk, jockey," one muttered, watching Sarah's Honda disappear down the main road. "Hope she can file paperwork better than the last one. That woman couldn't figure out which end of a requisition form was up." "At least she looks like she might stay awake during briefings," the other replied with a chuckle. "Remember that contractor last month who fell asleep during the safety brief?" Major Hayes nearly had a stroke. Neither of them knew they were watching one of the most decorated snipers in Army history walk onto their base. Neither of them suspected that the unassuming woman in civilian clothes had once held a rifle scope steady while enemy fighters moved 1,800 meters away, making shots that other snipers called impossible even after seeing the video evidence. Sarah Chen, though that wasn't the name she'd been known by in the mountains of Afghanistan and the urban warfare zones of Iraq, had spent the last 8 weeks learning how to be invisible again. Not the tactical invisibility she'd mastered in hostile territory, but something much harder, the art of being overlooked in a world that measured worth by visible rank and obvious achievement. The orders in her folder were deliberately vague, stripped of details that would attract attention or raise questions about why someone with her background was accepting such a mundane assignment. Administrative support, they read. Liaison duties. Nothing that would make anyone look twice or wonder about qualifications that went far beyond processing paperwork and scheduling meetings. The real orders, the ones that mattered, were locked away in a classified file that only 3 people at Fort Braxton were cleared to read. Those orders told a different story entirely. One involving medical retirement from units that didn't officially exist, service-connected injuries from operations that remained classified above most clearance levels, and a transition to civilian life that had been anything but smooth. She drove slowly through the base, taking in details with the automatic assessment of someone who'd spent years studying terrain and threat vectors in places where missing important information could mean death. Guard positions, sight lines, vehicle checkpoints, communication arrays, all of it cataloged and filed away in a mind that had been trained to notice everything that might matter when the shooting started. Lieutenant Colonel Rosa Martinez looked up from a stack of files as Sarah knocked on her open door. The office was standard military issue. Government furniture, motivational posters, family photos on the desk, and the slightly organized chaos of someone managing too many moving parts. "Miss Chen, come in, please." Martinez gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Sorry about the mess. We're in the middle of reorganizing our entire administrative structure." Sarah sat down, placing her folder neatly on her lap. "Ma'am, I'm here to help however you need me." Martinez scanned the orders, noting the sparse details and generic job description. Another warm body to help with the endless paperwork that seemed to multiply faster than they could process it. "Your background is a little thin," Martinez observed. "Previous experience mostly listed as various administrative positions. Care to elaborate?" It was a fair question, and Sarah had prepared for it. "Ma'am, I've worked in several different environments. Government contractor work, mostly. Nothing glamorous, but I'm familiar with military procedures and requirements." "Good, because what we need right now is someone who can handle logistics coordination without needing constant supervision." Martinez pulled out a thick binder. "We're supporting multiple training exercises over the next few months, plus some specialized requirements that I can't get into right now." Sarah nodded. "I understand, ma'am." "Operational security." Something in her tone made Martinez look up sharply. The response had been automatic, professional. The kind of acknowledgement that came from someone who actually understood what operational security meant rather than just parroting the phrase. "Exactly," Martinez said slowly. "You'll be working with Captain Dave Morrison in the Plans and Operations section. He'll get you oriented and assign your initial duties." "Yes, ma'am." "One more thing. Miss Chen, this base handles some sensitive training operations. You'll need to maintain appropriate discretion about what you see and hear. Can you handle that?" Sarah met her eyes directly. "Ma'am, I understand the importance of keeping sensitive information compartmentalized. You won't have any problems with me." Again, that tone of absolute certainty that suggested experience rather than just good intentions. Martinez made a mental note to check with security about Chen's background clearance. The walk to the Plans and Operations section took Sarah through corridors lined with photographs of military units, deployment photos, and commendation ceremonies. Each image told a story of service and sacrifice, of missions completed and personnel recognized for their contributions to national security. She paused briefly in front of a display case containing artifacts from recent deployments, unit patches, challenge coins, equipment that had been brought back as mementos. One patch caught her attention. 3rd Special Forces Group, Afghanistan 2019, to 2020. She recognized the time frame and location, though her own presence there remained classified at levels these displays could never acknowledge. "You interested in military history?" The voice belonged to Captain Morrison, who'd approached from behind while she was studying the display. He was in his early 30s, with the confident bearing of someone who'd earned his rank through solid performance rather than political connections. "Just curious about the different units that have served here," Sarah replied, stepping back from the case. "Most of this stuff is pretty recent," Morrison said, joining her in front of the display. "We support a lot of different operations from this base. Special Forces, Rangers, even some units that don't officially exist." He said the last part with the knowing smile of someone who thought he was sharing insider knowledge with a civilian who probably wouldn't understand the implications. "That must make logistics coordination pretty complex," Sarah observed. Morrison laughed. "Complex is one word for it. Come on, let me show you your workspace, and we'll talk about what we need you to do." The operations section was a maze of cubicles, conference rooms, and workstations covered with maps, communication equipment, and the inevitable stacks of paperwork that seemed to be the military's true universal language. Personnel moved with purposeful energy, managing the endless flow of information that kept training exercises and operational deployments running smoothly. "This is yours," Morrison said, indicating a desk equipped with a computer terminal and phone. "Nothing fancy, but it should handle everything you need. Your main job will be tracking equipment requests, coordinating transportation, and maintaining operational schedules." Sarah settled into the chair, noting the computer's security settings and the classification levels available through the terminal. Standard administrative access. Nothing that would let her see the really sensitive material. "Any questions so far?" Morrison asked. "Just one. What's the typical timeline for processing priority requests?" "Depends on what we're talking about. Routine stuff, maybe 48 to 72 hours. Emergency requests." He shrugged. "Those get handled as fast as we can make them happen. And if there's a conflict between operational requirements and standard procedure?" Morrison looked at her with new interest. "That's a pretty sophisticated question for someone in administrative support." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "I like to understand the big picture. It helps me prioritize when things get busy." "Fair enough. The answer is that operational requirements always take precedence. We'll break rules, bend regulations, and work around bureaucracy if that's what it takes to support people in the field." It was the right answer, and Sarah felt a flicker of respect for Morrison's priorities. Too many officers got so caught up in procedures that they forgot the human cost of delayed decisions. "Understood, sir. I'll keep that in mind." The morning passed quickly as Morrison introduced her to the various systems and procedures that governed their operations. Database management, communication protocols, coordination with other sections. All routine administrative work that required attention to detail, but no special expertise. What Morrison didn't notice was how quickly Sarah absorbed the information, how efficiently she navigated the computer systems, and how her questions revealed an understanding of military operations that went far beyond typical civilian knowledge. By lunchtime, she'd already identified 3 inefficiencies in their current procedures and mentally outlined solutions that could improve response times. But suggesting improvements would have to wait. For now, she needed to establish herself as competent but unremarkable. The base cafeteria was crowded with personnel from various units, creating the kind of diverse mix that characterized major military installations. Sarah moved through the serving line with her tray, listening to conversations at nearby tables while maintaining the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone still adjusting to military culture. She found an empty table near the window, positioned where she could observe the room while appearing to focus on her meal. Old habits from deployment environments where situational awareness could mean the difference between life and death. "Mind if we join you?" The voice belonged to Morrison, who'd approached with 2 other officers, a major she didn't recognize, and a captain whose name tape read Williams. "Of course not," Sarah replied, gesturing to the empty chairs. Sarah Chen, "Meet Major Robert Hayes and Captain Jennifer Williams," Morrison said as they settled around the table. "Sarah's our new administrative support in plans and ops." Hayes looked her over with the casual assessment that career officers applied to new personnel. "Administrative support? What kind of background do you have?" "Various contractor positions," Sarah replied, using the same vague description she'd given Martinez. "Nothing too exciting." "Well, excitement is overrated in this business," Williams said with a laugh. "The best days are the boring ones where nothing goes wrong." "Speaking of which," Hayes interjected, "what did you think of this morning's briefing about the upcoming exercise?" Morrison looked puzzled. "I haven't had a chance to brief Sarah on Operation Kodiak yet. That's this afternoon's agenda." "Operation Kodiak?" Sarah asked, maintaining the tone of someone hearing the name for the first time. "Multi-unit training exercise," Morrison explained. "Special forces, Rangers, some conventional units. Pretty complex logistics coordination." Hayes leaned forward, with the expression of someone about to test the new person's knowledge. "Miss Chen, in your previous positions, have you ever had to coordinate air asset integration with ground operations?" It was clearly intended as a gotcha question, something that would expose her limitations and establish the proper hierarchy of expertise. Hayes was probably expecting confusion or a request for clarification. Instead, Sarah considered the question seriously before answering. "The key challenge is usually communication protocols and timing coordination. Different units have different operational tempos, and air assets have weather and fuel constraints that ground operations don't face." The three officers exchanged glances. That was a more sophisticated answer than they'd expected from administrative support. "That's actually pretty accurate," Williams admitted. "Have you worked with air coordination before?" Sarah realized she'd revealed too much knowledge and needed to walk it back. "I've read some manuals and observed a few exercises. You pick things up over time." "Reading manuals," Hayes said with a slight smirk. "That's one way to learn about military operations." The condescension was subtle but unmistakable. Hayes was establishing that there was a difference between theoretical knowledge and real experience, and he was making sure Sarah understood which category he thought she belonged in. "I'm sure there's a lot I don't understand about the practical realities," Sarah replied diplomatically. "I'm here to learn and support however I can." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Good attitude. Don't worry, you'll pick up the rest as you go along." As they finished lunch and prepared to return to their duties, Sarah reflected on the delicate balance she needed to maintain. Show enough competence to be useful, but not so much that people started asking uncomfortable questions about her background. It was going to be harder than she'd thought. The afternoon briefing for Operation Kodiak took place in a secure conference room with maps covering the walls and classified material scattered across a central table. Sarah entered with her notebook and pen, taking a seat in the back, where administrative support personnel typically positioned themselves during operational planning sessions. The room gradually filled with officers and senior NCOs from various units, their conversations creating the background buzz of people preparing for complex undertakings. Sarah recognized the energy, the mixture of anticipation and professional focus that characterized military personnel approaching challenging missions. Morrison stood at the front of the room, waiting for the last stragglers to find seats before beginning his presentation. "Gentlemen, ladies, welcome to the final coordination briefing for Operation Kodiak. For those who haven't been tracking, this is a multi-unit exercise designed to test integration between Special Operations Forces and conventional units in a complex operational environment." He clicked to his first slide, showing an overhead view of the training area. The scenario involves a hostage rescue operation in urban terrain, with multiple entry points and potential complications that will test our planning and execution capabilities. Sarah studied the map with professional interest, automatically identifying key terrain features, potential observation points, and likely infiltration routes. The exercise area was well designed, offering multiple tactical challenges that would require sophisticated coordination between different unit capabilities. Special Forces teams will conduct the primary assault, Morrison continued, while Ranger elements provide security and conventional units establish outer perimeters and logistics support. Major Hayes raised his hand. What's the communication plan for coordinating between units with different procedures and equipment? Good question, Morrison replied. We'll be using frequency hoppers with common encryption, plus relay stations positioned at key points throughout the area. Captain Williams looked concerned. What if we lose primary communications? Do we have backup procedures that everyone's been trained on? Morrison hesitated slightly. Backup communications will follow standard field expedient procedures. Each unit should be familiar with those protocols. Sarah frowned, recognizing a potential problem that Morrison was glossing over. Different units had different standard procedures, and what worked for Special Forces might not work for conventional infantry. Without proper coordination, backup communications could become a nightmare of conflicting protocols and missed connections. She raised her hand tentatively. Excuse me, sir. When you say standard field expedient procedures, are you referring to the universal emergency frequencies or unit-specific protocols? The room went quiet. Morrison looked surprised that administrative support was asking technical questions about communication procedures. Well, both, I suppose. Each unit should know how to fall back on emergency frequencies if their primary systems fail. But sir, Sarah continued carefully, if I understand correctly, some units use different frequency spacing and timing protocols. Even on emergency frequencies, they might not be able to communicate effectively without prior coordination. Hayes turned in his chair to look at her directly. Miss Chen, that's a pretty detailed understanding of military communications for someone in administrative support. Sarah felt the weight of attention from around the room and realized she'd stepped too far into operational territory. I've done some reading on them. Communication procedures, sir. I just want to make sure our logistics support can maintain contact if things get complicated. Reading, Hayes repeated, his tone suggesting skepticism about the value of theoretical knowledge. Have you ever actually used military radios in a field environment? The question hung in the air, and Sarah faced a choice. She could deflect, downplay her knowledge, and maintain her cover. Or, she could provide the kind of answer that would help solve a real problem that could affect the exercise. Sir, I've had some experience with communication equipment in previous positions. The issue I'm concerned about is that frequency hoppers from different manufacturers don't always sync properly, especially when units are operating under stress and time constraints. Morrison leaned forward. What kind of experience? Sarah chose her words carefully. Government contractor work that involved technical coordination with military units. Nothing classified, but enough exposure to understand some of the practical challenges. It wasn't entirely a lie, though it left out some rather significant details about the nature of that coordination. Interesting, Williams said. So, what would you recommend for backup communications? Now Sarah was committed. She couldn't retreat without looking foolish. But providing a detailed solution would reveal knowledge that went far beyond what administrative support should possess. Well, ma'am, you might consider designating specific relay points with personnel who have equipment from each participating unit. That way, if primary communications fail, each unit can contact their designated relay, and the relays can coordinate with each other using common procedures. The silence that followed was different from before. Instead of surprise at an administrative person asking technical questions, it was the quiet of military professionals recognizing a good solution to a complex problem. Sergeant Major Frank Rodriguez, who'd been listening from the corner, spoke up. That's actually not a bad idea. We've seen communication failures screw up exercises before, and it usually happens exactly the way she's describing. Morrison nodded slowly. We'll incorporate that into the plan. Miss Chen, Can you work with communications personnel to identify appropriate relay positions and equipment requirements? Yes, sir. I'll coordinate with the signal section and get you a recommended setup by tomorrow morning. As the briefing continued, Sarah noticed that other personnel were paying more attention to her presence. She'd crossed the line from invisible administrative support to someone who might actually have useful contributions to make. The problem was that having useful contributions required knowledge and experience that her cover identity couldn't explain. After the briefing, Morrison approached her as she was packing up her notes. "Sarah, that was good thinking about the communication backup. Where did you learn about military radio procedures?" She'd been expecting this question and had prepared an answer. "Some of the contractor positions I've held involve supporting military exercises. You pick up technical knowledge when you're around it long enough. Government contractor work can cover a lot of territory," Morrison observed. "What kind of contracts were you working on?" "Logistics support mostly. Equipment coordination, transportation planning. The kind of background work that keeps operations running smoothly." It was vague enough to be plausible while explaining her familiarity with military procedures. Morrison seemed satisfied, but Sarah noticed he was studying her with more interest than he'd shown that morning. "Well, whatever your background, I'm glad to have someone on the team who can think about the operational implications of administrative decisions." As she walked back to her desk, Sarah reflected on the danger of competence. Every time she solved a problem or provided useful insight, she risked exposing knowledge that Sarah Chen, administrative support, shouldn't possess. But she also couldn't bring herself to stay silent when she saw problems that could be solved, issues that could affect mission success and personnel safety. It went against everything she'd been trained to believe about service and responsibility. The challenge was finding a way to contribute without revealing who she really was. Later that evening, as the base settled into its nighttime routine, Sarah remained at her desk reviewing the communication plan for Operation Kodiak. The building was mostly empty, with only security personnel and a few dedicated workaholics maintaining the eternal military tradition of staying late to solve complex problems. She'd managed to obtain technical specifications for the radio equipment each unit would be using, and the compatibility issues were worse than she'd thought. Without proper coordination, backup communications could fail spectacularly, leaving units isolated and unable to coordinate their actions. Her computer screen displayed a detailed analysis of frequency allocations, timing protocols, and equipment limitations that would take most administrative personnel weeks to compile and understand. But for someone with her background, it was routine technical preparation, the kind of analysis she'd done dozens of times in operational environments where communication failures could mean death rather than just failed exercises. "Working late?" The voice belonged to Sergeant Major Rodriguez, who'd entered the office area quietly enough that most people wouldn't have noticed his approach. But Sarah had developed habits that were hard to break, and she'd been aware of his presence from the moment he'd entered the building. "Just trying to finish the communication analysis for tomorrow morning, Sergeant Major." Rodriguez approached her desk, noting the complexity of the data displayed on her screen. "That's pretty detailed work for someone who's been here less than a day." Sarah looked up from her computer, meeting his eyes directly. Rodriguez was a veteran NCO with more than 20 years of service, the kind of soldier who'd seen enough to recognize when something didn't quite fit the expected pattern. "I want to make sure I understand the requirements properly, Sergeant Major. Better to ask stupid questions now than to create problems during the exercise." "Those don't look like stupid questions," Rodriguez observed, gesturing at her screen. "That looks like the kind of analysis we usually get from signal specialists with years of experience." The comment hung between them, not quite an accusation but clearly a request for explanation. Sarah had to decide how much truth she was willing to share. "Sergeant Major, I've worked around military operations long enough to know that communication failures can have serious consequences. I'd rather over-prepare than under-deliver." Rodriguez studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Miss Chen, I've been in the Army long enough to recognize competence when I see it. What I'm seeing from you suggests background and experience that goes beyond typical administrative support. It was a direct challenge, delivered with the kind of respectful directness that senior NCOs used when they needed straight answers. Sarah faced the moment of truth she'd been dreading since arriving at Fort Braxton. "Sergeant Major, some backgrounds are more complicated than they appear on standard paperwork." "I imagine they are," Rodriguez replied quietly. "The question is whether those complications are something we need to know about, or something we should respect your privacy about." The offer was clear. She could maintain her cover, and he would respect that choice. Or she could provide more information, trusting his discretion about what to do with it. "I appreciate your discretion, Sergeant Major. For now, I'd prefer to focus on doing my job as effectively as possible." Rodriguez nodded. "Understood. But Miss Chen, if there's ever anything you need support with, or if your background becomes relevant to our operations, you know where to find me." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the quiet office, staring at her computer screen and thinking about the impossible balance she was trying to maintain. Every day brought new challenges to her cover identity, new situations that required knowledge and experience she wasn't supposed to possess. Sooner or later, someone was going to ask questions she couldn't answer without revealing the truth about who she really was. The question was whether she'd be ready for that moment when it came. 3 days into Operation Kodiak, the carefully planned exercise transformed into something no one had anticipated. What began as a routine training scenario became a test of real-world crisis management when the unthinkable happened. The first indication of trouble came at 0347 hours through the base emergency notification system. Sarah woke in her temporary quarters to the sound of sirens and the mechanical voice of the alert system echoing across Fort Braxton. "All personnel. This is not a drill. Security condition Delta. All personnel report to designated rally points immediately." This is not a drill. Security condition Delta meant imminent threat to the installation. Sarah was dressed and moving before her conscious mind had fully processed the announcement. Muscle memory from years of operational deployments took over, her body responding to crisis with the automatic efficiency that had kept her alive in hostile territory. The base had transformed in the minutes since the alert. Emergency lighting cast everything in harsh red shadows. Personnel moved with urgent purpose between buildings, following procedures drilled into them through countless exercises. But there was an edge of real fear that training scenarios couldn't replicate. Sarah reached the operations center to find organized chaos. Personnel from multiple units crowded around communication stations, their voices creating a background buzz of urgent coordination. Maps covered every available surface, marked with positions and movement vectors that told the story of an evolving crisis. Morrison spotted her across the room and waved her over to a communication station where he was coordinating with base security. His face was grim, the easy confidence of peacetime operations replaced by the focused intensity of real emergency management. "Sarah, thank God you're here. We've got a situation that's gone way beyond anything we planned for." "What's the status, sir?" she asked, automatically falling into the clipped, efficient communication style that crisis situations demanded. "Hostile infiltration of the exercise area. Unknown number of subjects, armed, and they've taken hostages from one of the ranger units conducting training." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. Exercise scenarios suddenly becoming real was every military planner's nightmare, the moment when theoretical preparation met actual life and death consequences. "How many hostages?" she asked. 12 rangers, including their team leader. The hostiles are demanding. Hell, we're not even sure what they're demanding yet. Communication has been sporadic. What assets do we have available for response?" Morrison looked at her sharply. "Sarah, your administrative support. This isn't your, sir. With respect, I need to understand the situation to coordinate logistics and communication support effectively. What assets are available?" The question was reasonable, but the way she asked it, with the automatic assumption that she would be involved in crisis coordination, revealed training and experience that administrative personnel weren't supposed to possess. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this on We've Got. Special Forces teams still in the exercise area, but they're not in position for immediate response. Rangers from other units, but they need time to coordinate and move to the contact area. Base Reaction Force is mobilizing, but they're not equipped for hostage rescue operations. Sarah processed the information rapidly, her mind automatically calculating distances, response times, and tactical options. The exercise area was 15 kilometers from the main base, accessible by limited routes that could be easily monitored or blocked by hostile forces. "What about air assets?" she asked. "Weather's marginal. We've got helicopters on standby, but visibility is poor, and we don't have clear intelligence on hostile capabilities." "Sir, what's the timeline for civilian authorities to respond?" Morrison paused in his coordination efforts to look at her directly. "Sarah, those are very specific questions for someone in administrative support." Before she could respond, Major Hayes burst through the door with an expression that suggested the situation had just gotten worse. "Morrison, we've lost contact with the forward command post. Last transmission indicated they were taking fire and going to ground." "Jesus," Morrison muttered. "How many personnel at the CP?" "6, including the exercise controller and communication team." Sarah stepped forward without thinking. "Sir, recommend we establish alternate communication relay immediately. If the primary CP is compromised, we need redundant command capability." Both officers turned to stare at her. Hayes recovered first. "Miss Chen, this is operational planning." "I think you should, Major Hayes," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there before. "If we lose command and control capability, those hostages die. Administrative concerns are secondary to mission requirements." The room went quiet. Around them, personnel at nearby stations turned to see what was happening, drawn by the sound of a civilian support employee speaking to a field-grade officer with the kind of direct challenge typically reserved for senior military leaders. Morrison studied her face, seeing something that made him reconsider his assumptions about who he was dealing with. "Sarah, what kind of experience do you have with crisis management?" "Enough to know that we're wasting time with procedural discussions while people's lives are at stake." It wasn't a complete answer, but Hayes could see that Morrison was listening to her with new attention. "All right," Morrison said slowly. "What do you recommend?" Sarah moved to the map table, her bearing shifting subtly as she transitioned from administrative support to something approaching operational leadership. Personnel around the room watched with growing curiosity as she studied the terrain features and unit positions. "First, establish alternate CP. Here," she said, pointing to a position that offered good communication lines while being defensible. "Move communication assets from the compromised position to maintain command capability." "That makes sense," Hayes admitted grudgingly. "Second, we need real-time intelligence on hostile capabilities and positions before committing response forces. Recommend deploying reconnaissance elements to establish observation points. Here and here." She indicated positions that would provide overlapping coverage of the hostage location. Morrison leaned over the map, following her reasoning. "Those are good observation positions. How did you identify them so quickly?" Sarah realized she was operating on tactical knowledge that Sarah Chen shouldn't possess, but the crisis momentum carried her forward. "Terrain analysis, sir. High ground with good sight lines and concealment. Third, coordinate with air assets to establish overwatch capability once weather permits. Even if direct support isn't possible, aerial observation would provide intelligence we need for planning." Hayes was studying the map with professional interest. "That's actually a comprehensive approach. Where did you learn tactical planning?" Before Sarah could answer, Sergeant Major Rodriguez entered with an update that shifted everyone's attention back to the immediate crisis. "Sir, we've re-established contact with the compromised CP. They're in a defensive position approximately 800 meters from the hostage location, but they've sustained casualties, and their movement is limited." "How many casualties?" Morrison asked grimly. "2 wounded. 1 serious. They need medical evacuation, but the route is exposed to hostile observation." Sarah stepped forward again, her voice carrying quiet authority. "Sergeant Major, what's the terrain like between the CP and potential landing zones for medical evacuation?" Rodriguez looked at her with surprise, then answered the question professionally. "Mostly open ground, with limited concealment. Landing zones are available, but aircraft would be vulnerable during approach and departure. Recommend coordinating medical evacuation with diversionary action," Sarah said. "Create activity at alternate locations to draw hostile attention while aircraft extract casualties." Morrison looked at her with growing amazement. "Sarah, that's sophisticated tactical thinking. What's your real background?" The question hung in the air while emergency communications continued around them. Sarah faced the moment she'd been dreading since arriving at Fort Braxton, the point where maintaining her cover became impossible without failing in her duty to help save lives. "Sir, my background is more complicated than my personnel file indicates. Right now, people are dying, and we need to focus on getting them home safely." It was an admission and a deflection simultaneously, acknowledging that she wasn't who she appeared to be while refusing to elaborate during the crisis. "We'll discuss your background later," Morrison said firmly. "Right now, I need to know if you can help coordinate this response." Sarah met his eyes directly. "Yes, sir. I can help." The operation to extract casualties from the compromised command post unfolded exactly as Sarah had outlined. Diversionary helicopter flights drew hostile attention to the north while medical evacuation aircraft approached from the south, successfully recovering the wounded personnel without further casualties. But success came with consequences. Word spread through the operations center that the civilian administrative support had provided tactical planning that probably saved lives. Personnel, who'd barely noticed her presence before, began watching her with new interest and growing questions. Captain Williams approached Sarah as she coordinated communication updates between rescue teams and base operations. "Miss Chen, I've been thinking about the tactical advice you provided during the medical evacuation planning." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, not looking up from the radio logs she was monitoring. That level of tactical sophistication doesn't come from reading manuals or observing exercises. Where did you really learn to think like that? Sarah had been expecting this question, but she still wasn't ready to answer it completely. "Ma'am, I've had experience supporting military operations in various capacities. You learn by being around professionals who know what they're doing." "What kind of support experience?" Williams pressed. Before Sarah could respond, Rodriguez joined their conversation with news that would complicate her situation even further. "Ma'am, we've got a problem. The Special Forces teams in the area are requesting immediate fire support coordination, but our forward air controller is one of the casualties we just evacuated." Williams looked stricken. "Without FAC capability, we can't provide close air support. Those teams are going to be on their own." Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with possessing capabilities others didn't have. She could coordinate fire support, had done it dozens of times in operational environments. But doing so would reveal training that civilian personnel weren't supposed to possess. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I might be able to help with that." Both Williams and Rodriguez stared at her. "Sarah," Williams said slowly, "fire support coordination requires specialized training and certification. You can't just, ma'am, I understand the requirements. I'm saying I might have the qualifications to help." Rodriguez stepped closer, his expression intent. "Miss Chen, are you telling us you're a qualified forward air controller?" The moment stretched out while emergency communications continued around them. Sarah knew that answering truthfully would destroy her cover identity, but staying silent could cost lives. "Sergeant Major, I'm telling you that I can coordinate fire support if that's what the mission requires." It wasn't a direct admission of her qualifications, but it was close enough that both officers understood the implication. "Jesus," Williams breathed. "Who are you really?" Before Sarah could answer, Morrison's voice cut across the operations center with urgent authority. With quote, Jesus quote, with quote, with quote, with quote, 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 "All stations, we've got eyes on the hostage location. Hostile forces are prepared to execute prisoners if rescue operations begin. We need options, and we need them now." Sarah moved to the communication station, where Morrison was coordinating with field teams, her bearings shifting completely as crisis management took precedence over maintaining her cover. "Sir, what's the tactical situation?" "Hostiles are holding 12 Rangers in a building with limited access points. They've got overwatch positions established, and they're threatening to execute hostages if we attempt rescue. What assets do we have available for assault?" Morrison looked at her with the expression of someone who'd stopped questioning her involvement and was focused entirely on mission success. "Special Forces teams in position for immediate assault, but the approach is across open ground with no concealment. It's a suicide run." Sarah studied the map display, her mind automatically processing tactical options with the speed that came from years of operational experience. The situation was complex, requiring coordination between multiple elements and precise timing that left no room for error. "Sir, recommend coordinated approach. Establish fire support to suppress overwatch positions while assault teams approach from multiple directions. Create enough chaos to prevent organized response." "We'd need somebody to coordinate fire support," Morrison replied. "Our FAC is in surgery." "I can do it," Sarah said without hesitation. The operations center went quiet around them. Personnel at nearby stations turned to hear what was happening, drawn by the sound of a civilian employee volunteering for one of the military's most demanding and dangerous specialties. Hayes approached from across the room, his expression showing the same mixture of disbelief and desperate hope that characterized everyone's response to Sarah's unexpected capabilities. "Miss Chen, fire support coordination is not something you learn from contractor work. That requires military training at levels that take years to develop." Sarah looked around the room at faces, showing growing recognition that she was far more than she appeared to be. The moment had arrived when maintaining her cover became impossible. "Major Hayes, right now we have 12 Rangers who are going to die unless we can coordinate effective rescue operations. Whatever questions you have about my background can wait until those people are safe." Morrison stepped forward with the decisive authority of a commander making critical decisions under pressure. "Sarah, if you can coordinate fire support, I'm putting you in that position. Can you handle it?" "Yes, sir." "Then do it." What happened next transformed Sarah from mysterious civilian support into someone whose capabilities commanded immediate respect from everyone in the operations center. She moved to the fire support coordination station with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd done this work countless times before. Her hands found the communication equipment without hesitation. Her voice shifted to the clipped, precise tone that artillery and air support personnel recognized as professional competence. "Gunfire control, this is Operations Center. Requesting immediate fire mission, grid coordinates to follow." The response came back immediately. "Operations Center, gunfire control. Standing by for fire mission. Grid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, enemy overwatch positions, approximately 6 personnel in hardened positions. Request suppression fires to enable assault team movement. Copy grid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, enemy overwatch, 6 personnel, hardened positions, suppression fires. What units are available for fires?" Sarah coordinated with air and artillery assets with the kind of professional competence that left no doubt about her qualifications. Personnel around the operations center watched in amazement as she managed multiple fire support elements while maintaining awareness of ground team positions and timing requirements. "Airstrike inbound, 30 seconds, she announced to Morrison. "Recommend assault teams begin movement on my mark." Standing by, came the response from Special Forces teams positioned for the rescue attempt. Artillery fires complete, overwatch positions suppressed. Airstrike, impact, mark, mark, mark. Assault teams, you are clear to move. The coordination was flawless, combining artillery suppression, airstrikes, and ground assault with the kind of precise timing that could only be achieved by someone with extensive experience in exactly this type of complex operation. Within minutes, radio traffic confirmed mission success. Operations Center, assault teams. Objective secured. All hostages recovered. Hostile forces neutralized. No friendly casualties. The operations center erupted in restrained celebration, the kind of professional satisfaction that came with successful completion of dangerous missions. But the attention quickly focused on Sarah, who was securing her communication equipment with the calm efficiency of someone completing routine duties. Rodriguez was the first to approach her, his expression showing the kind of respect typically reserved for senior military professionals. "Ma'am, that was textbook fire support coordination. Where did you learn to do that?" Sarah looked around the room at faces, showing curiosity, respect, and growing recognition that everything they'd assumed about her was wrong. "Sergeant Major. That's a conversation for after we complete post-mission procedures." It was a deflection, but delivered with the kind of authority that made it clear the deflection came from someone with the background to make that decision. Morrison stepped forward with an expression that combined gratitude and amazement. "Sarah, what you just did probably saved those Rangers' lives, but it also raises questions that we're going to need answers to." "I understand, sir. For now, let's focus on completing the mission and getting everyone home safely. But when this is over, we're going to have a very detailed conversation about who you really are." As the operations center shifted back to normal coordination procedures, word began spreading throughout the base about the civilian administrative support who just coordinated a complex fire support mission with the expertise of a seasoned military professional. The whispers started immediately. Who was Sarah Chen? Where had she learned fire support coordination? How had someone with her capabilities ended up in an administrative support position? But among the Special Forces and Ranger personnel who'd just been rescued, the questions were different. They wanted to know the call sign of the person who'd coordinated their fire support, because that level of professional competence deserved recognition and respect. And somewhere in those conversations, someone was going to recognize the tactical signature of coordination they'd seen before in operational environments where life and death decisions were made by people whose names were whispered with awe in special operations communities around the world. The post-mission debrief took place in a secure conference room with representatives from every unit involved in the rescue operation. As personnel filed in, Sarah noticed the way they looked at her. No longer the casual dismissal of civilian support, but the attentive interest reserved for people whose capabilities had been proven under pressure. Morrison called the meeting to order with the formal tone that characterized military debriefs. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to conduct post-mission analysis of the team hostage rescue operation. Before we begin detailed discussion, I want to acknowledge the fire support coordination that made mission success possible." He gestured towards Sarah, who sat at the back of the room in her usual position for administrative personnel. "Miss Chen provided fire support coordination that probably saved lives today. Her performance was exceptional." Captain Mark Stevens, the Special Forces team leader who'd led the ground assault, stood up from his chair. "Sir, request permission to address Miss Chen directly." "Granted." Stevens turned towards Sarah with an expression that combined professional respect and growing curiosity. "Ma'am, The fire support coordination we received today was some of the most professional work I've seen in 15 years of operations. That level of competence doesn't develop overnight. Sarah met his eyes steadily. Thank you, Captain Stevens. I'm glad the mission was successful. Ma'am, with respect, that's not an answer to my question. Where did you learn to coordinate fire support like that? The room was silent, everyone waiting for her response. Sarah realized that the moment of complete honesty had arrived. The point where maintaining any pretense became impossible. Captain Stevens, my background includes experience with fire support coordination in operational environments. What kind of operational environments? Stevens pressed. Before Sarah could answer, Hayes interjected with a question that would change the direction of the entire conversation. Miss Chen, during the coordination, you used specific terminology and procedures that are associated with classified operational units. How are you familiar with those protocols? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had used communication procedures that were specific to Special Operations Forces, language that civilian personnel wouldn't know and shouldn't have access to. Rodriguez leaned forward with the expression of someone I've been thinking about this question for hours. Ma'am, I've been reviewing the communication logs from today's operation. Your fire support coordination follows patterns that are characteristic of specific types of units. What kind of units? Williams asked. Rodriguez looked directly at Sarah. The kind that don't officially exist on paper. The implication was clear. Sarah's tactical performance suggested background with special access programs. Classified units that operated beyond the normal military structure. The kind of organizations that produced personnel with exactly the capabilities she demonstrated. Morrison stepped forward with the authority of someone who'd decided to pursue the truth, regardless of the consequences. Sarah, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. What is your real background? Sarah looked around the room at faces showing mixture of professional curiosity and growing respect. These were people who'd proven themselves in market, dangerous situations, who understood the cost of the kind of expertise she'd displayed. My background includes service with units that conduct operations classified above the level we can discuss in this setting. It was the closest she could come to complete honesty without violating security requirements that still governed her life even in retirement. Stevens nodded slowly. Ma'am, are you telling us you have special operations background? I'm telling you that I have background that qualified me to coordinate the fire support mission we completed today. Hayes looked frustrated with the careful non-answers. Miss Chen, we're not asking you to reveal classified information. We're asking about your qualifications and experience. Major Hayes, Sarah replied calmly. There are aspects of my background that I can't discuss in detail. What I can tell you is that I spent 8 years in positions that required exactly the kind of skills I use today. Rodriguez stood up with an expression that suggested he'd reached a conclusion. Ma'am, 8 years of that level of operational experience, combined with the tactical competence we observed today, there's only a limited number of units that produce personnel with those capabilities. Sarah remained silent, neither confirming nor denying his implication. Sergeant Major Rodriguez, Morrison said, what are you suggesting? Sir, I'm suggesting that we have someone on this base whose operational background includes service with the most elite units in the Army. The kind of units where personnel develop the exact capabilities we saw demonstrated today. Captain Stevens looked at Sarah with new understanding. Ma'am, if Sergeant Major Rodriguez is correct, then your presence here isn't coincidental. Someone with your background doesn't end up in administrative support by accident. Sarah met his gaze directly. Captain Stevens, my current position serves my needs and allows me to contribute in ways that match my current circumstances. It was the first hint she'd given about the personal reasons behind her transition from operational service to civilian employment. Williams leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd connected several pieces of a complex puzzle. Sarah, are you saying that you chose this position? That you're here because you want to be, not because it's the only job you could find? Ma'am, I'm saying that service takes many forms, and sometimes the most important contributions aren't the most visible ones. Morrison studied her face, seeing something that made him approach the conversation from a different angle. Sarah, I need to ask about security clearances. If you have the background we're discussing, then you have clearances that go far beyond what your current position requires. Yes, sir. My clearances are sufficient for any requirements this base might have. Hayes looked stunned. Miss Chen, are you telling us that you have clearances that exceed what most of us have? Sarah smiled slightly. Major Hayes, I'm telling you that clearance levels aren't something we should discuss in this setting. The non-answer was an answer in itself. Personnel with backgrounds in classified special operations typically maintain security clearances at levels that most military personnel never achieved. Rodriguez stepped forward with the respect that senior NCOs showed to people whose service they recognized and honored. Ma'am, I think I speak for everyone in this room when I say that we're honored to serve alongside someone with your background and capabilities. Sarah felt something inside her chest loosen slightly. For months, she'd been hiding from recognition and respect that had once defined her identity. Hearing that respect expressed by people who understood its meaning touched something she'd thought was permanently buried. Sergeant Major, the honor is mine. Working with professionals like all of you reminds me why I chose military service in the first place. Stevens stood up with an expression that suggested he was about to ask the question that everyone was thinking. Ma'am, with respect, there's one more thing we need to know. What's your call sign? The room went completely silent. Call signs were personal identifiers that carried history and reputation within special operations communities. Among elite personnel, call signs were earned through operational performance and carried with pride throughout entire careers. Sarah looked around the room at faces, showing professional curiosity and growing anticipation. These were people who understood the significance of the question and the weight that certain call signs carried within the community. She'd maintained her cover identity for months, deflecting questions and hiding capabilities that had once defined her entire sense of self. But sitting among people who recognized and respected her service, she felt ready to reclaim the identity she'd spent so long trying to escape. My call sign, she said quietly, is Phantom Zero. The reaction was immediate and electric. Every special operations veteran in the room recognized the name, though most had thought it belonged to legend rather than reality. Phantom Zero was whispered about in training centers and deployment briefings as an example of what was possible when skill, training, and courage combined in one person. Stevens went pale. Ma'am, PHHAM Zero is. We thought that was a myth. Someone made up to inspire new operators. PHAM Zero is real. Rodriguez breathed, his voice carrying awe that was rarely heard from senior NCOs. The longest confirmed kill in Army history. The operator who saved an entire battalion in Afghanistan. The sniper whose work is still classified because the missions were too sensitive to acknowledge. Hayes looked like he was seeing a ghost. The Phantom Zero? The operator who? Major Hayes, Sarah said gently. Some operational details remain classified. Morrison stood up slowly, his expression showing the kind of respect typically reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. Chief, we need to discuss your current assignment and how we can better utilize your capabilities. Sarah smiled at the automatic use of chief, the kind of title that special operations personnel used when addressing someone whose rank was less important than their operational reputation. Sir, my current assignment serves my needs and allows me to contribute appropriately, but I'm willing to discuss how my background might be useful in training and mentoring capacities. As the debrief concluded and personnel began filing out of the conference room, word was already spreading through Fort Braxton with the speed that only military communities could achieve. Phantom Zero wasn't a legend. She was real, she was here, and she'd been hiding in plain sight as administrative support for months. The whispers had begun, and they would only grow louder. News traveled through Fort Braxton with the speed that only earth-shattering revelations could achieve in a military community. Within hours of the debriefing, word had reached every corner of the base. Phantom Zero, the legendary sniper whose exploits had become the stuff of special operations folklore, had been working among them as civilian administrative support. The transformation in how personnel interacted with Sarah was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had barely acknowledged her presence before now stood straighter when she passed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when she entered rooms. The casual dismissal she'd grown accustomed to was replaced by the kind of respectful attention typically reserved for general officers. But it was Private First Class Miguel Santos who provided the moment that would define Sarah's transition from hidden legend to recognized leader. Santos was barely 19, fresh from basic training and still learning how military life worked at a real, operational base. He'd heard the stories circulating about Phantom Zero, but like most new soldiers, he wasn't entirely sure what they meant or why everyone seemed so awed by the revelation. He was walking past the operations building the morning after the debrief when he saw Sarah approaching from the parking area. To him, she still looked like the same civilian employee he'd seen around the base for months. Jeans, pullover, unassuming presence that didn't demand attention. But something made him pause and really look at her for the first time. The way she moved wasn't casual civilian walking. It was purposeful, controlled, with the kind of situational awareness that suggested someone who'd learned to stay alive in dangerous places. Her eyes swept the environment constantly, noting details most people would miss. Her posture was relaxed but ready, like someone who could transition from calm to combat ready in an instant. Santos had been trained to recognize military bearing, and what he was seeing didn't match someone who'd only worked in administrative support. As Sarah approached the building entrance, Santos made a decision that came from instinct rather than conscious thought. He came to attention with the sharp precision of someone who'd spent months drilling proper military courtesy. "Ma'am," he said, rendering a perfect salute. Sarah stopped in surprise. In all the months she'd been at Fort Braxton, no one had saluted her. She was civilian personnel, not entitled to military courtesy regardless of her background. But looking at Santos's young face, she saw something that made her understand the significance of the moment. He wasn't saluting Sarah Chen, administrative support. He was saluting Phantom Zero, the operator whose service had earned respect from the finest soldiers America could produce. She returned the salute with the precision that years of military service had ingrained in her muscle memory. Not the casual acknowledgement of routine, courtesy, but the deliberate respect of one warrior recognizing another. "Carry on, soldier," she said quietly. Santos dropped his salute, but he didn't move. Instead, he looked her directly in the eyes, with the kind of earnest intensity that only very young soldiers could manage. "Ma'am, I want you to know what you did over there, the missions everyone's talking about. It means something to people like me. Knowing that soldiers like you exist makes me want to be better." The words hit Sarah harder than she'd expected. For months, she'd been running from recognition and the weight of expectations that came with her reputation. But standing in front of this young soldier, she understood that her service meant something beyond personal achievement or career advancement. It represented possibility, proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. Hope that the next generation could live up to the standards set by those who'd come before. "Private Santos," she said, reading his name tape. "The most important thing you can do is serve with integrity and take care of your fellow soldiers. Everything else follows from that." "Yes, ma'am, I'll remember that." As Santos walked away, Sarah stood for a moment in the morning sunshine, processing what had just happened. The first salute she'd received since arriving at Fort Braxton hadn't come from a senior officer or experienced NCO. It had come from a 19-year-old private who understood that service deserved recognition regardless of current job titles or organizational charts. But Santos's salute was just the beginning. Word of the exchange spread through the base with the same speed that had carried news of Sarah's identity revelation. But now the story included something that touched the pride and tradition that defined military culture, a young soldier recognizing excellence and rendering appropriate respect. By noon, something unprecedented was happening throughout Fort Braxton. Personnel who encountered Sarah began saluting, not because they were required to by regulation, but because they wanted to acknowledge service that had earned their respect. A sergeant in the motor pool saw her walking past and snapped to attention, his salute sharp enough to cut glass. Two specialists loading supplies stopped their work to render proper military courtesy. A master sergeant with 25 years of service saluted with the kind of respect typically reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. Each salute carried its own message. Recognition of capabilities that exceeded anything they'd imagined. Gratitude for service that had protected American interests in places most people would never know about. Pride in serving alongside someone whose achievements had become legendary within the special operations community. Sarah returned each salute with the dignity and respect that the gesture deserved, but the accumulating weight of recognition was becoming overwhelming. She'd spent months hiding from exactly this kind of attention, and now it was impossible to escape. The transformation reached its peak during the afternoon shift change, when hundreds of personnel moved between duty stations and training areas. As Sarah walked from the operations building toward the parking area, she found herself moving through corridors lined with soldiers rendering salutes. It wasn't organized or coordinated. No one had issued orders or established procedures. It was the spontaneous expression of respect from people who understood the significance of service and wanted to acknowledge excellence when they encountered it. The sound of boots snapping together echoed through hallways like thunder. The sight of hundreds of salutes being rendered simultaneously created a moment of ceremony and recognition that transcended normal military routine. At the center of it all, Sarah walked with the calm dignity that had characterized her service throughout her career. She returned every salute with precision and respect, acknowledging each person's recognition while maintaining the humility that had always defined her approach to leadership. But the most meaningful moment came as she reached the main exit. Colonel James Richardson, the base commander, stood waiting by the doors. As a full colonel with more than 25 years of service, Richardson commanded Fort Braxton and everyone on it. His presence at this moment sent a clear message about the significance of what was happening. "Chief," he said, using the title that special operations personnel employed when addressing someone whose operational reputation superseded their formal rank. "Permission to render proper recognition?" Sarah came to attention automatically, her bearing shifting to the formal military posture that represented years of training and discipline. Richardson's salute was perfect, sharp, deliberate, held for exactly the right duration to convey maximum respect. As the base commander, his recognition carried the weight of institutional acknowledgement that Sarah's service deserved formal honor regardless of her current position. "Chief, on behalf of Fort Braxton and the United States Army, thank you for your service and your continued contributions to our mission." Sarah returned the salute with the precision that had characterized every aspect of her military career. "Sir, thank you for the opportunity to serve alongside the finest soldiers America produces." As Richardson dropped his salute, spontaneous applause began from the personnel who had gathered to witness the exchange. It started with a few individuals and spread until hundreds of soldiers were clapping with the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for promotion ceremonies and retirement celebrations. But this was different. This was recognition of service that had been hidden, acknowledgement of capabilities that had been concealed, celebration of excellence that had been disguised as ordinary administrative support. Sarah stood at attention throughout the applause, accepting the recognition with the dignity that befitted someone whose service had earned respect at the highest levels of military leadership. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The pride that came from knowing her sacrifices and achievements mattered to people who understood their significance. The moment concluded with Richardson stepping forward to shake her hand with the formal respect that characterized military recognition of exceptional service. "Chief, I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss how we can better utilize your capabilities. Fort Braxton would be honored to have someone with your background contribute to our training and operational preparation. Sir, I'd be happy to discuss how my experience might benefit the mission. As the crowd began to disperse and normal base operations resumed, Sarah reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past few days. She'd arrived at Fort Braxton seeking anonymity and quiet refuge from a past that had demanded everything she had to give. Instead, she'd found recognition, respect, and the opportunity to contribute to something meaningful without returning to the high-stress operational environment that had led to her transition to civilian life. The salutes would continue, but they'd become part of a new normal where her service was acknowledged and her capabilities were recognized as assets to be valued rather than secrets to be hidden. The meeting with Colonel Richardson took place in his office the following morning, with Sarah arriving in civilian clothes but carrying herself with the military bearing that was now impossible to disguise. The comfortable anonymity she'd maintained for months was gone, replaced by recognition that would follow her throughout her remaining time at Fort Braxton. Richardson gestured to a chair across from his desk, but his demeanor was different from how he might treat civilian personnel. There was respect in his posture, the kind of consideration that senior officers showed to people whose service they honored even when formal rank structures didn't require it. Chief, I've spent the last 24 hours reading everything I'm cleared to read about your background, he began. What I can access is impressive enough. What I can't access is probably even more significant. Sarah nodded. Sir, there are aspects of my service record that remain classified at levels beyond most people's clearance. I understand. What I want to discuss is your future here at Fort Braxton. Someone with your capabilities shouldn't be processing paperwork and answering phones. Colonel, with respect, I chose this position because it met my needs at the time, but I'm open to discussing how my background might be useful in other capacities. Richardson leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd been thinking carefully about possibilities. Chief, we have training programs that could benefit enormously from your experience. Sniper schools, leadership development, tactical planning courses. Your operational background could provide authenticity that we currently lack. What kind of training programs? Sarah asked. Advanced marksmanship instruction for special operations candidates. Tactical thinking courses for officers transitioning into leadership positions. Crisis management training based on real-world experience rather than theoretical scenarios. Sarah considered the proposal. Teaching would allow her to contribute meaningfully without returning to the high-stress operational environment that had led to her medical retirement. It would also provide purpose and direction that administrative support couldn't offer. Sir, I'd be interested in developing curricula that could help personnel avoid some of the mistakes I've seen in operational environments, but I'd want to focus on decision-making and tactical thinking, rather than just technical skills. Exactly what we need, Richardson replied. Chief, I'm authorized to offer you a position as senior instructor in our advanced training division. Government service position with appropriate clearance access and salary grade that reflects your qualifications. It was a generous offer that would formalize her status and provide resources to develop the kind of comprehensive training programs that could have lasting impact on military readiness. I accept, sir. Outstanding. Your first assignment will be developing a tactical decision-making course for company-grade officers. I want them learning from someone who's actually made those decisions under pressure. As the meeting concluded and Sarah prepared to transition into her new role, word of her appointment spread through Fort Braxton with the same speed that had characterized every development in her story. But the reaction was different now. Not surprise or curiosity, but satisfaction that proper recognition was finally being provided. The transformation extended beyond her official status to how personnel throughout the base interacted with her. Conversations that had once been polite but distant became engaged discussions about military service and professional development. Junior officers sought her guidance on leadership challenges. Senior NCOs discussed tactical problems with someone whose experience commanded their respect. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in her own sense of purpose and identity. For months, she'd been hiding from the recognition and responsibility that had once defined her life. Now she was reclaiming those aspects of herself while maintaining the stability and peace that civilian employment had provided. The first advanced tactical decision-making course began the following week with 12 company-grade officers selected based on their potential for senior leadership positions. Sarah entered the classroom with lesson plans that combined theoretical knowledge with practical experience gained through years of operational service. "Gentlemen, ladies," she began, "today we're going to discuss tactical decision-making under pressure. Not the theoretical kind you learn about in staff colleges, but the real-world kind where people's lives depend on your judgment and there's no time for extended analysis." She clicked to her first slide, showing a map of terrain that looked familiar to several officers who'd served in Afghanistan. "Your mission is to extract a high-value target from a compound in hostile territory. You have limited assets, uncertain intelligence, and a narrow window for execution. Your decisions will determine mission success and personnel survival." For the next 2 hours, she guided them through scenarios based on real operations, teaching them to think through complex problems with incomplete information while managing multiple variables that could change without warning. Captain Morrison, who'd been among the first to recognize her capabilities, raised his hand during a discussion of risk assessment. "Chief, how do you maintain confidence in your decisions when you know they could be wrong?" It was the kind of question that came from someone who understood the weight of command responsibility and wanted guidance from someone who'd carried that weight successfully. "Captain Morrison," Sarah replied, "confidence in tactical decision-making comes from preparation, training, and understanding that perfect decisions don't exist in operational environments. You make the best decision possible with available information, then adapt when circumstances change." She paused, considering how much personal experience to share. The goal isn't to avoid mistakes. The goal is to make decisions quickly enough to maintain initiative and flexibly enough to recover when your initial assessment proves incorrect. "But how do you deal with the consequences when decisions go wrong?" asked Lieutenant Jessica Torres, the youngest officer in the class. Sarah looked at her directly, seeing in Torres's expression the kind of earnest concern that characterized junior officers who understood the weight of leadership but weren't yet sure they could carry it effectively. "Lieutenant Torres, you accept responsibility for your decisions and their consequences. You learn from mistakes without being paralyzed by them, and you remember that the alternative to making difficult decisions is usually much worse than the risk of being wrong." The discussion continued with the kind of engaged participation that indicated students were connecting theoretical knowledge to practical reality. These officers were learning not just technical procedures, but the mindset and judgment that would serve them throughout their careers. After the class, Morrison approached Sarah as she was packing up her materials. "Chief, I wanted to thank you for what you're teaching us. This is the kind of practical knowledge that we can't get anywhere else." "Captain Morrison, you've shown real growth in your thinking since we started working together. Keep developing that analytical approach and you'll be ready for senior leadership positions." "I hope so. But Chief, I have to ask, doesn't it feel strange teaching people who outrank you technically?" Sarah smiled. "Captain Morrison, in operational environments, competence and experience matter more than formal rank. What matters is helping people develop the capabilities they need to succeed and bring their people home safely." As the weeks progressed, and Sarah's reputation as an instructor grew, personnel from other bases began requesting access to her courses. Her teaching methods, which combined technical knowledge with real-world experience, were producing officers whose tactical thinking exceeded anything available through standard military education. The Advanced Tactical Decision-Making course became a model program that was eventually adopted throughout the Army's professional military education system. Officers who completed the course reported feeling more confident in their decision-making abilities and better prepared for the complex challenges of modern military leadership. But beyond the formal recognition and career advancement, Sarah had found something more valuable: a way to serve that honored her past achievements while building toward a future that felt sustainable and meaningful. 6 months after her identity revelation, Fort Braxton had transformed into something approaching a center of excellence for tactical training and leadership development. Sarah's programs had expanded beyond the initial decision-making course to include advanced marksmanship instruction, crisis management training, and leadership development seminars that drew participants from across the military. The base that had once struggled with routine training exercises was now setting standards that other installations sought to emulate. But more importantly, the personnel who trained there were developing capabilities and confidence that would serve them throughout their careers. Sarah's office in the Advanced Training Division reflected her journey from hidden legend to recognized leader. The walls displayed certificates of appreciation from various units, photographs from training exercises, and letters from former students describing how her instruction had influenced their performance in operational deployments. But the most meaningful item on her desk was a simple challenge coin from Private Santos, SPS, now Specialist Santos, who'd been the first to salute her after her identity was revealed. The coin represented not just personal recognition, but the pride that came from knowing her service continued to inspire the next generation of soldiers. The morning routine that had once involved hiding her capabilities now included reviewing lesson plans for courses that pushed students to develop the kind of tactical thinking and leadership skills that could save lives in real operational environments. The transformation was complete, but the mission continued. Morrison knocked on her doorframe, carrying coffee and the easy familiarity that had developed between them over months of professional collaboration. He'd been promoted to major and was now serving as deputy director of the Advanced Training Division, working closely with Sarah to develop curricula that other bases were requesting. "Chief, I've got the after-action reports from the officers who completed your course last month," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "The feedback is outstanding. They're reporting improved performance in decision-making exercises and better confidence in crisis management scenarios." Sarah looked through the reports, noting specific comments about how the training had influenced their approach to leadership challenges. Each positive evaluation represented validation that her teaching methods were producing the kind of practical improvements that made the effort worthwhile. "Major Morrison, what's the status on the Regional Training Center proposal?" she asked. "Moving forward faster than expected. Command recognizes the value of what we're doing here, and they want to expand it to serve multiple installations. You'd be the senior instructor for tactical decision-making and crisis management, with authority to develop programs that could influence military education throughout the system." It was an opportunity that would have been unimaginable during her months as anonymous administrative support. The chance to influence military training at levels that could affect thousands of personnel, helping them develop capabilities that might save lives in future deployments. "That's a significant responsibility," Sarah observed. "Chief, if anyone can handle it, you can. Your programs are already being used as models for military education reform. This would just formalize what's already happening." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Major Rodriguez, who'd become one of Sarah's most effective collaborators in developing practical training scenarios. His experience with personnel development complemented her operational background, creating programs that were both realistic and educationally effective. "Chief, Major Morrison," Rodriguez said, "I've got news about the Advanced Leadership Development Program. We're getting requests from Special Forces Command, Ranger School, and the Sergeant Major Academy. They want to send their top instructors here to learn our methods." Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction at the recognition that her work was receiving from the institutions that represented the finest traditions of military education. These organizations didn't request training collaboration lightly. Their interest indicated that Fort Braxton was producing something genuinely valuable. "Sergeant Major Rodriguez, what kind of training are they requesting?" "They want to understand how we're combining operational experience with educational methodology to produce officers and NCOs who can think tactically under pressure. Your approach to teaching decision-making is creating personnel who perform better in stress scenarios than graduates from traditional programs. As they discussed the logistics of expanding the training programs, Sarah reflected on the unexpected direction her life had taken. She'd come to Fort Braxton seeking anonymity and healing from experiences that had left deep scars. Instead, she'd found purpose, recognition, and the opportunity to contribute to something meaningful without returning to the high-stress operational environment that had led to her medical retirement. The scars remained, both visible and invisible, but they'd become sources of strength rather than shame. Her experiences in hostile territory, the pressure of life and death decisions, the weight of some them, responsibility for other people's safety. All of it had been transformed into wisdom that could help others develop the capabilities they needed to succeed in similar circumstances. "Chief," Morrison said, "there's one more thing. Colonel Richardson wants to discuss a formal ceremony to recognize your contributions to the base and the training programs you've developed." Sarah hesitated. Recognition ceremonies were part of military culture, but they also meant public attention and formal acknowledgement that she'd spent months avoiding. "Major Morrison, I appreciate the gesture, but ceremonies aren't really necessary. The success of the students is recognition enough." Rodriguez leaned forward with the expression of someone who understood both her reluctance and the importance of institutional recognition. "Chief, with respect, this isn't just about you. It's about setting an example for other personnel who might be hiding capabilities that could benefit the military. Your story shows that service can continue in different forms." It was a perspective Sarah hadn't considered. Her journey from hidden legend to recognized instructor could inspire other veterans who were struggling with transitions from operational service to civilian life. The ceremony wouldn't just acknowledge her contributions, it would demonstrate that military experience had value beyond active duty service. "All right," she said finally. "If Colonel Richardson thinks a ceremony would benefit the military community, I'll participate." The ceremony took place on the same parade field where she'd first walked as anonymous civilian support. But now she stood at the center of formation, wearing the dress blue uniform that reflected her actual service record rather than the civilian clothes that had disguised her background for months. Colonel Richardson's introduction touched on her operational achievements while maintaining appropriate security about classified details. Chief Sarah Chen, known to CITERE, the Special Operations Community, by her call sign PHA Tan Tom 0, represents the finest traditions of Army service. Her transition from operational excellence to educational leadership demonstrates that military expertise continues to serve our nation in multiple capacities. The assembled personnel, hundreds of soldiers from various units, listened with respectful attention as Richardson described the training programs she'd developed and their impact on military readiness. But they also understood they were witnessing something rare. Formal recognition of service that had been hidden, but was now being honored appropriately. Chief Chen's contributions to tactical education and leadership development have influenced military training beyond this installation. Her programs are being adopted throughout the Army as models for combining operational experience with educational methodology. Richardson paused, looking directly at Sarah. "Chief, your service in operational environments was exemplary. Your service as an educator has been transformational. On behalf of the United States Army, thank you for your continued dedication to developing the leaders who will protect our nation." The applause that followed was sustained and enthusiastic, reflecting genuine appreciation from personnel who understood the significance of her contributions. But what made the moment special wasn't the formal recognition. It was the knowledge that her work was making a difference in preparing soldiers for the challenges they would face in service. As the ceremony concluded and personnel began filing past to offer personal congratulations, Sarah felt a sense of completion that had been missing since her transition from operational service. She'd found a way to honor her past while building a future that felt sustainable and meaningful. The journey wasn't finished. New challenges and opportunities would continue to emerge. But she'd learned that service could take multiple forms, that expertise gained through sacrifice could benefit others, and that recognition and respect could coexist with the peace and stability she needed for continued healing. Specialist Santos, now preparing for selection into Special Forces training, stopped in front of her with the same earnest expression he'd worn during their first encounter. "Chief, I wanted to thank you for everything you've taught us. The training you provided is going to help me succeed in selection. But more importantly, it's going to help me be the kind of soldier who brings everyone home." It was the highest compliment she could receive. Acknowledgement that her teaching was preparing personnel not just for success, but for the kind of leadership that protected lives and completed missions successfully. Specialist Santos, you've shown real growth in your tactical thinking and leadership potential. Trust your training, trust your judgment, and remember that the best leaders are those who never stop learning. As the afternoon transitioned to evening and Fort Braxton settled into its normal routine, Sarah walked across the parade ground where everything had changed during those critical days when her cover identity crumbled and her true capabilities were revealed. The base that had once seen her as anonymous civilian support now recognized her as a valued contributor whose experience and expertise enhanced their mission. The personnel who had once dismissed her lack of military understanding now sought her guidance and respect her judgment. But perhaps most importantly, she'd learned that healing didn't require hiding from the past. Instead, it could come from transforming painful experiences into wisdom that helped others avoid similar struggles and develop the capabilities they needed to succeed. The woman who had once operated in the shadows of classified missions was now working in full daylight, sharing her expertise with people who could benefit from her knowledge. The tactical skills that had once been used to eliminate threats were now being used to develop protectors. Her phone buzzed with a text message from one of her former students, now deployed overseas. "Chief, used your decision-making framework during a complex operation last week. Mission success, no casualties. Thank you for teaching us to think under pressure." Messages like this had become regular parts of her routine, each one reinforcing the impact her work was having on individual performance and unit effectiveness. The feedback loop between teaching and application was proving beneficial for everyone involved. As she drove home to the apartment that had evolved from a refuge to a base of operations for meaningful work, Sarah reflected on the transformation that had brought her to this point. The journey from Phantom Zero to Sarah Chen and back to Chief Chen represented not just a career change, but a fundamental shift in how she understood service and contribution. The tactical expertise that had once been applied in classified operations was now being used to develop the next generation of military leaders. The decision-making skills that had been tested in life-and-death scenarios were now being taught to officers who would face similar challenges in future deployments. The healing that had begun with simple anonymity was now continuing through meaningful connection and shared purpose. Each successful student represented validation that her experiences, rather than being burdens to carry alone, could become bridges connecting her hard-earned wisdom to eager minds just beginning their own journeys in service. The pain that had once felt like nothing more than evidence of personal cost was revealing itself as the source of insights that could prevent others from making the same mistakes or falling into the same traps that had once seemed unavoidable. Chief Sarah Chen, Phantom Zero, had found her way home, not to the past with its mixture of achievement and trauma, but to a favor future where service took new forms and old wounds could heal through helping others grow stronger. The circle was complete, but the mission continued, enriched by understanding that true strength often lay not in what you could endure alone, but in what you could help others become. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us, where are you watching from, and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget?